Friends, thank you again for the gift of my sabbatical. It was a remarkable gift of time. I noticed that Linda has been counting my time away by Sundays. There were 16 of them, right? A lot of time. To say that it was time off doesn't fully express what the last few months have been like for me. Instead, it feels more apt to say for me that it was time set apart to rest, which I did, to be restored and renewed, which I am, and also time to reflect. My sabbatical included several occasions for intentional reflection with others about ministry. Among those meetings was a consultation of some 80 church leaders from a variety of denominations and church settings across the country who gathered to talk about the pressing challenges and promising opportunities we see congregations facing in light of all we have experienced in the last 2.5 years. Additionally, our congregation is one of 300 churches selected to participate in a 5-year longitudinal study conducted by the Hartford Institute on Religion Research on the post-COVID church. In the next year or so, each one of you will receive an invitation to respond to a survey as they gather data. My part in that study began in June. Also this summer, with a grant from the Louisville Institute, I was able to take 9 clergy colleagues and friends away with me on 2 retreats. One on Cape Cod, when all the rhododendrons were in full fuchsia bloom, and the other here in the mountains in Breckenridge, where a couple of moose joined us for dinner beside the deck one evening. They stayed for such a long time. While together in these beautiful places, we pastors lingered in long conversations, talking about our experiences over the last 2 years, the separations, the worries, the losses, the grief, the need to rethink how to do just about everything, the steep learning curve of technology, the sheer number of new decisions we made. There was a lot to process, a lot to lament, a lot to learn from. But we also noted our surprise at the enormous creativity unleashed in our congregations by the Spirit who showed up for us again and again and again. We talked about the callings and the faith-filled responses of our congregations to all of the crises that were brought into clearer focus during this time. The commitments to reckon in new ways with racial injustice, to engage in learning and action regarding gun violence prevention, mental health concerns, climate change, and the faltering of our treasured democracy. Finally, we openly acknowledge the complications of our churches in coming out of the pandemic. We talked about the lower attendance of in-person worship, even as we celebrate the safety and the flexibility of folks being able to join church activities online. We wondered what to do about the loss of connection and engagement, the waning volunteer energy, and what it might mean in the long run for church budgets. We talked about the transitions brought on by the Great Resignation and how our churches were not exempt from that. 8 of the 10 churches represented among the clergy who went on retreat with me have experienced significant staffing changes in the last 2 years. And we also expressed concern at how the rate of churches folding and closing forever accelerated during the pandemic. None of our congregations is the same now as we were before COVID began. None of us will be going back to the way things were before. That truth doesn't mean that somehow we have failed. It simply means that the world in which we now live, one that is still enduring a global pandemic, is permanently different. There's no going back. Some might say that's how things always are. We are always being changed. But right now, it seems that this contemporary moment is flooded with consequence and significance, doesn't it? Maybe it feels that way because of the sudden shifts we went through, including the upending of so many of our habits and routines. Many things still have not settled down, and we don't know how they will eventually land. There's also the enduring tenderness we still feel, like an open wound, a sense of vulnerability, because there has been so much illness and so much death. Other shifts have shaken us too. The shocking retrenchment of laws we thought we could rely on, the wildly competing narratives playing out in the public square, the ease with which lies are now accepted by many people as truth, and the ways that deadly gun violence has become a more normative part of our common life. Of course, I hear African American siblings reminding us that none of that is new for them. Still, I don't think we can deny that something has changed, even if we can't see or even articulate it yet. Maybe it's that more of us are trying to pay attention. For example, the protests on the streets after George Floyd's murder were the largest in U.S. history. By some counts, the Black Lives Matter movement at that moment involved 26 million people in the United States and in many places around the world. That's not nothing. We might think of that massive response as an opening, a chance for something new and saving to enter and take hold, a flicker of hope in a dark night, a bright thread of promise. I wonder if in the midst of the upheaval, that's exactly what we need to keep looking for and leaning into, the places where people show up in large groups and small to gather in common concern, to offer ourselves with care, to join in solidarity with the suffering, and to stand in defiance of death-dealing forces. Every act of love, every good word, every fervent prayer, a thread joining a wider weaving of connection, giving us the sustenance we need for this time, and bringing into our bruised and battered world a little more mercy, a little more hope, more healing, more kindness, more justice, more love. Last month, just as he was to speak at New York Chautauqua on the topic of safe asylum for dissident writers, Salman Rushdie was brutally assaulted by a madman furiously wielding a knife. As soon as the attack started to happen, as many as 20 people rushed forward from the audience and leapt onto the stage. Several grabbed the attacker and pulled him down. Others attended immediately to Mr. Rushdie and his wounds. All of it happened in an instant. Strangers jumped up from the audience and saved his life. Rebecca Solnit studies how people behave in the midst of disasters and critical moments in our collective life. The San Francisco earthquake, the munitions explosion in Halifax, Hurricane Katrina, 9/11. In her book, A Paradise Built in Hell, she notes that yes, when terrible things happen, some people fall apart and behave more badly than ever, becoming selfish and greedy and even violent. That's the story that often grabs the headlines. But the larger story The more common story, the less sensational but no less dramatic truth is that in the midst of crisis, more often than not, people fall together. We draw nearer to each other. We look out for one another. We gather together in shared solidarity and offer communal care. We step up in all kinds of ways to help people in need. Neighbors take care of neighbors. People spontaneously, impulsively reach out to catch and rescue strangers. On the morning of 9/11, a flotilla of boats, ferries, tugboats, police boats, fireboats, converged on the Hudson River to evacuate 500,000 people from lower Manhattan. No one organized the rescue. It just happened. A few years later, the so-called Cajun Navy followed their example after Hurricane Katrina. Anyone who had a boat and could get into New Orleans sailed in to help grandmothers get down off their roofs and to come to the aid of families stuck on freeway overpasses. In the wake of every disaster or catastrophe, there's a large body of evidence to show that most people respond not with violent marauding, as we're often led to believe, but instead with genuine care, with remarkable generosity, and consistently with acts of love. All of which leads Rebecca Solnit to wonder what it would be like if we behaved this way with that kind of grace all the time. How can we get there without going through a disaster, she asks. That's the question. The Apostle Paul would jump in to say that we are the answer to that question. That's the church's reason for being. Woven together by love and made to give that love away, that's who we are. That's the church's mission. That's our calling, our inspiration, and our identity. In his letter to the Romans, Paul paints a picture of what that church looks like. He names the practices that both shape the life of the gathered community and are its main exhibits. There's an exchange of mutual affection, he says, and a zeal for honoring one another. The church is a community of care and belonging. No one is left to struggle alone in their sorrow or grief. We weep together. We rejoice as one. We show up for one another. Burdens become lighter because they get divided. Joys multiply because they're shared. All these strands of living get woven together into one durable fabric of love, which also means that the members of the church carry a common purpose. We hold fast to what is good. We hate what is evil. That's the encouragement Paul offers us, and then he takes it further. Respond to evil with good. It's a challenging word, but it's also one we've heard before. It's the hardest thing Jesus ever told us to do. Love your enemies, he urges us. Pray for those who persecute you. Romans 12 has been called Paul's version of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Do not be overcome by evil, Paul says in an echo of Jesus. Instead, overcome evil with good. Perhaps that's the charge that sums up our calling. This command to overwhelm evil with love sits at the very heart. We allow the fierce and tender love of Christ to shape everything we say and do. We aim to overcome estrangement with goodness. We reach out with care and we make the concerns of others our own, so that instead of falling apart, we fall together. When we're flagging, we lean on each other's strength. When we're afraid, we borrow each other's courage. When we're lost, we look to each other to find clarity and direction. When we falter, we're met with forgiveness. And when we're feeling hopeless, full of despair and disgust at the state of our world, we look around this room, or we open our mind's eye, and we see how we are in this together, and how we are here for each other, together in the muddle and the mess, the struggle and the joy. There is goodness here to sustain us. We shine the light of that goodness for one another. We hold each other in its warmth. Love surrounds us on every side, and love weaves in and through and between a bright thread, a golden ribbon. And we remember that alone, by ourselves, we are too weak to do God's work in the world. It's too hard and too lonely. But weave us together in a covenant of love by sturdy promises and the open arms of God's wide welcome. And we learn that love expands, hope grows, kindness becomes contagious, justice becomes possible. The mercies of God, Paul speaks of, they overflow. They pour out to fill the church. They fill our lives. They fill the earth. And that can change everything. This is the good news that gives us life. This is the good news that we are called together to become and to be. May it be so. Amen.